Melanie, you called this a family dinner, but you brought a court-appointed evaluator and a stack of forged medical records. You spent 30 minutes describing my cognitive decline while I sat right here, sipping my tea. You think you're filing for guardianship over a confused old man, but what you're actually doing is providing sworn testimony in a room that is currently being recorded, time-stamped, and transcribed by a legal-grade court reporter's suite. You didn't come here to save me, Melanie. You came here to commit perjury. And in my house, we don't clear the table until the verdict is read. Welcome back to Payback Logs. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're gonna love it here. I am Arthur Sterling. For 42 years, I sat on the federal bench. I have looked into the eyes of cartel enforcers, corporate embezzlers, and corrupt politicians. I have spent a lifetime discerning the minute tremors in a liar's voice and the specific, frantic way a person's eyes move when they realize their alibi has just collapsed. Retirement is supposed to be quiet. You're supposed to garden, read the classics, and let the world move on without your gavel. But the problem with being a judge is that you never stop seeing the world as a series of exhibits. And Exhibit A, standing in my foyer with a practiced look of concern and a briefcase full of lies, was my daughter-in-law, Melanie. It was a Thursday evening. My son, David, a good man, but one who inherited his mother's soft heart and none of my skepticism, had invited me over for what he called a check-in. When I walked into their dining room, the table wasn't set for a meal. There were no plates. Instead, there was a woman I didn't recognize, wearing a sensible gray blazer and holding a digital tablet. Next to her was Melanie, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief that I knew for a fact cost $80. "Arthur, thank you for coming," Melanie whispered. Her voice had that hollow, melodic quality people use when they're talking to a toddler or a golden retriever. "This is Dr. Aris. She's a clinical evaluator. We're worried, Arthur. The incidents, the wandering, the way you forgot David's birthday last month." I sat down at the head of the table. I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her that I hadn't forgotten David's birthday. I had sent him a wire transfer for $5,000, which Melanie had redirected into her interior design studio account 10 minutes after it landed. I knew because I still kept a close eye on the digital ledger of the trust fund I set up for him. "I see," I said. My voice was the stone gavel, low, resonant, and entirely devoid of emotion. "And what is the purpose of Dr. Aris's presence?" "We feel it's time for a protective guardianship, Arthur," Melanie said, leaning forward. "For your own safety, your judicial pension, it's a lot for someone in your condition to manage. We want to take that burden off your shoulders. We've already looked at the Gables. It's a lovely memory care facility, very secure." Dr. Aris looked at me, her pen poised over her tablet. "Mr. Sterling, do you know what year it is?" I looked at Melanie. I saw the way her foot was tapping under the table, a classic displacement behavior. She was nervous. She was broke. Her boutique was hemorrhaging cash, and my $150,000 a year judicial pension was the only judgment she cared about. It is 2026. The current president is in the third year of their term, and you, Melanie, are currently wearing a necklace that was stolen from my late wife's jewelry box 3 weeks ago while I was at the barber shop. Melanie's hand flew to her throat, covering the pearls. "Arthur, you gave this to me. See, Dr. Aris? The paranoia, the false accusations. He's been like this for months." I didn't argue. In a courtroom, the person who screams first is usually the one with the weakest case. I simply reached into my pocket and turned off the small, silent haptic buzzer on my phone. What Melanie didn't know was that my house, the one she wanted to sell, wasn't just a home. After I took down the syndicate in '09, the marshals had helped me secure the property. Every room in my study wing was outfitted with integrated, high-fidelity audio and video recording. It was designed for security, but in my retirement, I used it to dictate my memoirs. The Anner dinner was being recorded in 4K resolution. Every word Melanie said was being fed into real-time transcription software used by the Supreme Court. "Melanie," I said, standing up slowly. I made sure to let my hand tremble a bit, a little piece of evidence for her to cling to. "If you feel I am incompetent, then we should proceed by the book. No more informal dinners. We will see each other in probate court. I believe Judge Holloway is sitting on the bench this term. He was my clerk in '98. I'm sure he'll appreciate the thoroughness of your petition." The color drained from Melanie's face. She didn't expect me to invite the scrutiny. She expected me to be scared. She expected me to sign a voluntary power of attorney to avoid the embarrassment of a public hearing. "Arthur, don't be like that," she stammered. "We're doing this out of love." "Love is a fine motive, Melanie," I said, walking toward the door. "But in my experience, it's rarely a legal defense for fraud." I walked out of the house and into the cool evening air. I felt the open loop click into place. Melanie thought she was planning a funeral for my independence. She didn't realize she had just walked onto the witness stand. I got into my car and opened an app on my dashboard. File saved. Sterling, Melanie, Ambush 01, MP4. Transcript status complete. Keywords flagged: pension, memory care, burden. I whispered to the empty car, "Because when you try to bench a judge, you'd better make sure your own hands are clean. And Melanie, yours are covered in ink." I sat in my study, the room bathed in the soft green glow of 4 monitors. Most people my age use their computers for bridge or checking the weather. I use mine for discovery. For 40 years, I've known that the truth isn't found in what people say. It's found in the digital exhaust they leave behind. I opened the file from the dinner ambush. The transcription software had already highlighted the inconsistencies in Melanie's story. She claimed I had wandered on the 14th of last month. A quick cross-reference with my home security logs showed I was hosting a televised fundraiser for the Bar Association that evening. But then I found the smoking gun. I had authorized a background check on the Gables, the memory care facility Melanie was so eager to move me into. It wasn't just a lovely facility. It was a private equity-owned warehouse for the elderly that had been cited 14 times for neglect in the last fiscal year. I dug deeper into the referral network. There it was, a wire transfer for $25,000 from the parent company of the Gables to an LLC called Petal and Stone Designs. That was Melanie's failing interior design firm. She wasn't just trying to protect me. She was selling me. She had negotiated a finder's fee for my residency. She was treating her father-in-law like a high-commission real estate lead. I checked the audio feed from the hidden guest network in David's house. Melanie had forgotten that the smart home system she'd insisted I pay for was routed through my central server for maintenance. The recording started 10 minutes after I had walked out. "Did he buy it?" a voice asked. It was Melanie's sister, Tiffany. "He's suspicious," Melanie snapped, the sound of a wine cork popping echoing through the speakers. "But it doesn't matter. Dr. Aris is on the payroll. Once she signs the affidavit of diminished capacity, the judge will have no choice. Arthur's pension alone is $12,000 a month. Between that and the referral bonus from the Gables, I can finally clear the debt on the studio and get that lease on the G-Wagon. What about David?" "David believes whatever I tell him," Melanie laughed. "I've been moving his Father's Day cards to the trash and telling him Arthur forgot to call. He thinks his dad is disappearing. By the time the hearing happens, David will be too broken to fight me. He'll just want it all to be over." I felt a cold, sharp anger, not for myself, but for my son. She was weaponizing his grief, turning his love into a tool for her own greed. In my courtroom, this was called tortious interference with a family relationship. In my house, it was called a declaration of war. I didn't call David. I didn't scream at Melanie. I simply opened a new legal file on my desktop. Case name, Sterling versus Sterling and Aris, racketeering and fraud. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small leather-bound book. It was my private directory of the clerks. Over 40 years, I've mentored hundreds of young lawyers. They are now district attorneys, state senators, and senior partners. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. "Marcus," I said when he answered. Marcus was the current chief of police, a man who had once been my bailiff. "I need a discreet audit on a Dr. Aris. Check her medical license for previous administrative disciplinary actions. And Marcus, I'm going to need a court reporter who can handle a hostile witness deposition on very short notice." "Judge, what's going on?" "A structural failure in the family foundation, Marcus." I looked at the video of Melanie laughing on my screen. "We're going to perform a live correction." I hung up. I sat in the silence of my study, the gavel of justice resting on my desk. Melanie thought I was a man who couldn't remember the year. She didn't realize that a judge never forgets a fact, a debt, or a debt. "Type justice in the comments," I whispered, the open loop widening to include a criminal conspiracy. Because in the law, silence isn't an absence of evidence. It's the sound of a trap being set.
The old courthouse on 4th Street smells of floor wax, heavy oak, and the cold, unyielding weight of precedents. I didn't go in through the front doors, where the cameras and the tourists linger. I used the judge's entrance, the heavy iron gate in the back that requires a biometric thumbprint I've possessed since 1994. The sensor chirped, a green light washing over my hand. Even after retirement, the building recognized its architect. I walked down the marble corridor toward Chambers 4B. This was the office of Judge Marcus Halloway. 20 years ago, he was my top clerk, a brilliant, hungry legal mind who I'd taught to never trust a witness who cries without tears. Today, he was the administrative judge of the probate division. "Judge Sterling?" Marcus stood up from his desk, his eyes wide. "I heard, well, the rumor mill is spinning, Arthur. I heard you were stepping back, that there was a medical filing?" I sat in the guest chair, the one where I'd grilled 1,000 lawyers. I didn't look like a man with a failing mind. I looked like a man who was about to move for a directed verdict. "Judge Sterling," I said, my voice resonating in the high-ceilinged room. "The rumor mill is being fed by a professional liar. My daughter-in-law, Melanie, has filed for an emergency temporary guardianship, an ETG, hasn't she?" Marcus hesitated, then sighed, pulling a blue-backed folder from his pending tray. "She filed it 2 hours ago, Arthur, ex parte. She claimed you were a danger to yourself and that you'd threatened to liquidate your estate and vanish. She had an affidavit from a Dr. Aris. It looked thorough." I leaned forward. "Did she mention the $25,000 kickback she received from the Gables last Tuesday? Or the fact that she's currently wearing my late wife's stolen pearls in the lobby of her failing design studio?" Marcus froze. "Kickback? Arthur, if that's true, she's not just filed a petition, she's committed felony perjury and aggravated fraud on the court." "It's true, Marcus, and I have the high-fidelity audio to prove it." I opened my tablet and showed Marcus the hot mic recording from the smart home system. We sat in silence as Melanie's voice filled the chambers, laughing about my $12,000 a month pension and her plan to break David so he wouldn't fight her. I watched Marcus's face turn from professional concern to a cold judicial fury. "She's using the court as a collection agency," Marcus whispered. "She's turned my bench into a weapon against my mentor." "She's also hiding the filing from my son," I said. "Check the service records, Marcus. Who did she serve the papers to?" Marcus scrolled down the digital file. "It says here she served the notice to a co-resident of suitable age at your property, a man named James Smith. I don't know a James Smith, but I do know that Melanie hired a process server who happens to be her cousin's boyfriend. She's paper hanging, Marcus. She's trying to get the emergency order signed before David even knows there's a hearing." I stood up. I felt the ghost of my gavel in my hand. I want the hearing, Marcus. Don't dismiss the petition yet. If you dismiss it now, she'll just go to a different district or find a new lie. I want her to stand in open court. I want her to swear on the Bible. I want her to commit herself fully to the lie. That's risky, Arthur. If the evaluator sticks to her story, the evaluator, Dr. Aris, has a suspended license in 3 other states for pay-to-play diagnoses. I slid a second folder across the desk. My old clerks in the fraud squad did a deep dive this morning. She's not a doctor. She's a professional witness for hire. Marcus looked at the evidence. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. What do you need from me, Judge? I need a special master appointed to oversee the discovery, and I want the hearing moved to Courtroom 1A, the big one, the one with the gallery seats. Why the big room? Because, I said, walking toward the door, a funeral for a reputation deserves a large audience, and Melanie, she's about to give the performance of her life. I walked out of the courthouse. I called David from the parking lot. David, I said when he picked up, I need you to come to my study tonight. Bring your laptop. And David, don't tell Melanie where you're going. Tell her you're at the gym. We need to have a pre-trial conference. Dad, is everything okay? Melanie said you were having a bad day and then I should stay away for your own safety. The air is clearing, son. The ghost is back in the machine. I'll see you at 8. I hung up. I looked at the courthouse dome reflecting the afternoon sun. I murmured the open loop, now including a full judicial trap. Because when you play games in a judge's house, you don't just lose the case, you lose your freedom.
David arrived at my house at 8 p.m., his face a map of exhaustion and confusion. He walked into my study, his eyes darting to the floor, avoiding the stone face he'd feared since childhood. He looked like a man who was already mourning a father who was still sitting right in front of him. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "Melanie said. She said you were having episodes. She said you called her a thief and that you didn't know what month it was. I didn't want to believe it, but she had a doctor's note, Dad, a formal medical assessment." I didn't answer. I didn't get angry. I simply pointed to the guest chair and clicked a button on my console. "David," I said, the judge's baritone filling the room. "In my courtroom, we don't start with opinions. We start with the record. Sit down and watch the episode from Thursday night." I played the 4K footage of the ambush dinner. I watched David's face as he saw Melanie, the woman he loved, leaning over his father like a vulture over a dying lion. He watched her mention the pearls. He watched her mention the pension burden. Then I played the hot mic recording from their kitchen. The sound of Melanie laughing about breaking David echoed through my study. I watched my son's posture collapse. He looked at the screen as Melanie described his Father's Day cards going into the trash. He saw the wire transfer from the Gables to Petal and Stone Designs. She's selling us, David," he whispered, his hands shaking. "She's selling us both." "She's not just selling us, David," I said, leaning forward. "She's currently committing aggravated perjury in a probate filing that she's hidden from you. She's used your name as a co-petitioner without your knowledge." David looked up, a spark of the sterling fire finally igniting in his eyes. "What do we do? Do I call a lawyer? Do I confront her?" "No," I said. "If you confront her now, she'll hide the assets. She'll claim she was under stress and playing a victim. In a quiet audit, you don't spook the target. You lure them into the center of the kill zone." For the next 48 hours, David and I became the finest actors in the county. We played the part for the hidden camera she had undoubtedly installed in my home. I wore my sweater inside out. I left the sprinklers on in the rain. I sat on the porch and stared at a blank book for 3 hours. David would visit and leave looking devastated, making sure to call Melanie from the driveway, where I knew she was monitoring his GPS, to tell her, "You were right, Mel. He's worse. He didn't even recognize me today." I saw Melanie's response on the intercepted text logs. "It's okay, honey. The hearing is Monday. Once the judge signs the order, we can get him the professional help he needs. Stay strong." She was ecstatic. She was already shopping for the G-Wagon. She was so convinced of her victory that she didn't notice the process server who served her with the hearing notice was actually an undercover investigator from the district attorney's office. "She thinks the hearing is a formality," David said on Sunday night, sitting in the dark of my study. "She thinks she's walking into a coronation. She's walking into a sua sponte, on the court's own motion, inquiry," I said, closing the black leather binder that now contained every lie she told in the last month. "She thinks courtroom 1A is where I'm going to lose my freedom. She doesn't realize it's where she's going to find her prison cell." I checked the final evidence log on my monitor. Status: Melanie Sterling. GPS: home. Dr. Aris: hotel. Paid by Melanie. Testimony: recorded. Fraud: verified. I whispered to the dark room, because the most dangerous thing you can give a liar is enough rope to build a ladder. They always end up using it for a noose.
The night before the hearing, the house felt like a jury room during a deadlock. David sat in my late wife's favorite armchair, clutching a glass of water like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The staged decline had taken its toll. Watching his father pretend to lose his mind had opened old wounds he hadn't realized were still weeping. "Dad," he said, his voice a low rasp, "when she sits in that witness stand tomorrow, when she looks at the judge and tells him I'm a grieving son who can't see the truth, how do we stop the anger? I feel like I'm vibrating. I want to scream at her." I walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was the judge's hand, heavy, steady, and unmovable. In a trial, David, anger is a leak. It drains your credibility and fuels the opposition's narrative. Melanie wants you to scream. She wants the court to see a distraught, unstable son. You give her nothing but silence. You give her the Sterling stare. I walked to the wall behind my desk and pressed a recessed panel. A small biometric safe hummed to life. I pulled out a velvet-lined rosewood box, the one Melanie thought she had already picked clean. "Melanie stole the pearls, David," I said, opening the lid. "She thought they were the crown jewels of your mother's estate. She's currently wearing them to Petal and Stone meetings to look successful, but she's an interior designer, not an appraiser." I pulled out a simple, modest-looking silver locket on a sturdy chain. "This is the Eleanor Sterling insurance policy," I said. "Inside this locket isn't a photo, it's a micro SD card. Your mother was the daughter of a paranoid diamond merchant. She didn't trust safes, she trusted plain sight." I plugged the card into my reader. "What is that?" David asked, leaning in. "This is the secondary trust," I said. "Melanie has been trying to get her hands on my $150,000 pension. She thinks that's the big prize. What she doesn't know is that your mother left a $4 million quiet fund in a blind trust specifically for you, David. But there was a conduct clause." I scrolled to the bottom of the digital document. "If the beneficiary's spouse is found by a court of competent jurisdiction to have engaged in fraud, elder abuse, or financial impropriety against the Sterling family, the spouse is legally barred from ever accessing a single cent of this trust, even in the event of a divorce settlement." David stared at the screen. She's been killing herself to steal your small pension while she was literally standing in the room with $4 million she could have shared in if she had just been a decent person?" "Greed has a very narrow field of vision, son," I said. "She was so busy looking for the leak in my bank account that she didn't realize she was standing in the middle of an ocean. Tomorrow, when we reveal the fraud, she won't just lose my pension, she will be legally severed from your mother's true legacy forever. The law doesn't just punish, It excommunicates. David looked at the locket, then at me. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, crystalline clarity. He finally understood the Sterling method. We don't just win the argument, we eliminate the threat. Go home, David. Sleep. Tomorrow we go to Courtroom 1A. And remember, a judge doesn't seek revenge. A judge seeks the final order. I checked the GPS logs one last time. Melanie was at a high-end wine bar celebrating with Dr. Aris. I could see the signature of her credit card. She had just spent $400 on a victory dinner using David's emergency credit card. I whispered, closing the rosewood box, because the most expensive thing you can ever buy is a lie that a judge has already seen through.
Monday morning arrived with the kind of sharp, cold sunlight that reveals every crack in a building's facade. I dressed with the precision of a man preparing for a state funeral. I didn't wear a casual sweater this time. I wore my charcoal three-piece suit, my silver tie, and the watch Eleanor gave me when I was confirmed by the Senate. When I arrived at the courthouse, Courtroom 1A was already buzzing. Melanie was in the hallway, surrounded by her support team, 2 of her boutique employees, and Dr. Aris. Melanie was wearing a modest, dark navy dress, her hair pulled back in a grieving daughter bun. She was dabbing her eyes, playing the part of the exhausted caretaker to anyone who walked by. "Arthur, oh, Arthur," she said, rushing toward me as I stepped off the elevator. She tried to take my arm, her voice loud enough for the bailiff to hear. "You look so coordinated today. Did David help you get dressed? It's okay if you're confused about where we are. We're just here to talk to a nice man about your safety." I didn't pull away. I let her lead me toward the double doors. I leaned in, my voice a mere whisper that only she could hear. "Melanie," I said, "you're wearing the pearls again. You really shouldn't. The luster is fading, just like your alibi." She stiffened, her grip on my arm tightening for a second, before she smoothed her expression back into a mask of pity. "See, Dr. Aris, he's hallucinating again. He thinks I'm a stranger." We entered the courtroom. Melanie had expected Judge Holloway, my former clerk, to be on the bench. She thought she could play on his sympathy for his old mentor's decline. But as the bailiff called the room to order, the man who stepped through the rear doors wasn't Marcus Holloway. It was Judge Stephen Vance. Vance was a hanging judge from the criminal division, a man known for his zero-tolerance policy on perjury and his legendary ability to smell a shakedown from 3 miles away. He had been specially assigned to this probate hearing by the administrative office at 8 a.m. I saw Melanie's jaw drop. Her lawyer, a strip mall practitioner named Miller, who looked like he'd bought his degree at a car wash, frantically started shuffling his papers. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Judge Vance sat, adjusted his robes, and looked down at the petition. He didn't look at Melanie with sympathy. He looked at her like a bug under a microscope. "We are here on the matter of Arthur Sterling. Petition for emergency temporary guardianship filed by Melanie Sterling. Counsel, I've reviewed your emergency affidavit. It's quite colorful. You claim the proposed ward is a danger to his own financial stability and is currently suffering from severe unmanaged cognitive dissolution." "That is correct, Your Honor," Miller said, standing up with a shaky cough. "Mr. Sterling is simply not the man he once was." "Is that so?" Vance looked at me. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table. "Mr. Sterling, you are appearing pro se today, on your own behalf?" "I am, Your Honor, though I would note for the record that I am also appearing as an officer of the court. I have a sua sponte motion I'd like to hand up before we hear from the good doctor." Melanie leaned over to her lawyer, whispering frantically, "Why does he sound like that? He was drooling on the porch yesterday."
"Your Honor," Miller shouted, "we object. Mr. Sterling is not mentally competent to file motions. That is the entire point of this hearing." Judge Vance leaned over the bench, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Miller, I've known Arthur Sterling for 30 years. If he wants to hand up a motion, he's going to hand up a motion. Bailiff, bring it here." I handed over the black leather binder, the final order. Inside wasn't just my defense, it was the digital trap. "Your Honor," I said, standing tall, "what you have before you is a notice of criminal referral. It contains the GPS logs, the high-fidelity audio recordings, and the financial trail of a $25,000 kickback paid to the petitioner by a facility called the Gables. It also contains the sworn statement of my son, David Sterling, regarding the signature harvesting and identity theft perpetrated by his wife." The courtroom went silent. I could hear the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the wall clock. Melanie stood up, her face turning a violent shade of red. "He's lying. He's obsessed. He can't handle getting old." "Sit down, Mrs. Sterling," Judge Vance said. He didn't look up from the binder. He was reading the transcript of the hot mic recording. I watched his brow furrow, his lips thinning into a line of pure judicial disgust. "Dr. Aris," Vance said, finally looking at the evaluator, "I see your name here. I also see a report from the State Medical Board regarding your suspended license in Illinois. Would you like to step to the stand and verify your clinical findings under penalty of perjury, or would you like to take the side exit before the marshals arrive?" Dr. Aris didn't hesitate. She grabbed her briefcase and walked toward the back of the room. She didn't look at Melanie. She didn't look at the judge. She vanished through the double doors, leaving Melanie standing alone at the petitioner's table. "Your Honor, Miller started. "Quiet, Mr. Miller," Vance snapped. He looked at Melanie. "Mrs. Sterling, you have filed a sworn affidavit claiming this man was incoherent on the 14th of last month. I have here a video of him giving a keynote address to the American Bar Association on that exact night. You claimed he stole those pearls you're wearing. I have the footage of you taking them from his bedroom at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday." Melanie looked at the gallery. She looked for David. She found him sitting in the front row, staring at her with a look of absolute icy detachment. "David," she whispered, "honey, tell them he's sick." David didn't move. He didn't speak. He just held up the silver locket, the insurance policy. I whispered, the open loop now a gaping hole beneath Melanie's feet. Because in a court of law, the only thing more dangerous than a judge is a judge who has been forced to take the stand. The silence in courtroom 1A was no longer the silence of a hearing. It was the silence of a gallows. Melanie stood at the petitioner's table, her hands clutching the mahogany edge so hard her knuckles were white. The grieving daughter mask hadn't just slipped, it had disintegrated, revealing the frantic, cornered predator underneath. Judge Vance didn't look at his notes anymore. He leaned over the bench, his shadow falling over Melanie like a dark cloud. "Mrs. Sterling," Vance said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen some low things. I've seen stick-up kids and cartel bookkeepers, but I have rarely seen a more calculated, cynical attempt to weaponize this court for the purpose of elder abuse and grand larceny. You didn't just lie to a judge, you lied to the law itself." "Your Honor, please," Melanie's lawyer, Miller, stammered, his forehead slick with sweat. "My client she was under immense financial pressure. Her business—" "Her business is a shell for her vanity, Mr. Miller," Vance snapped. "And according to the sua sponte evidence provided by Judge Sterling, that financial pressure was relieved by a $25,000 kickback from a facility that has more health violations than a slaughterhouse. Bailiff." The heavy side doors opened. 2 deputy marshals stepped in. They didn't stand by the door. They walked directly to Melanie's table. "Melanie Sterling," Vance intoned, standing up to his full, imposing height. "Based on the evidence of aggravated perjury, filing a fraudulent petition, and financial elder abuse, I am denying this guardianship with prejudice. Furthermore, I am exercising my authority to hold you in summary contempt of court. Marshals, take her into custody. I want her processed and held for the district attorney. We're going to discuss a formal indictment for racketeering." Melanie let out a sharp, jagged scream as the first cuff clicked around her wrist, the same wrist that was still draped in my late wife's stolen pearls. "David! David, do something!" she shrieked, twisting her head toward the gallery. "He's an old man. He's tricking them. Tell them about the wandering. Tell them you saw it." David stood up. He didn't look at the marshals. He didn't look at the judge. He walked to the center of the aisle, stopping 3 feet from his wife. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, the Father's Day card she had thrown in the trash 3 years ago, which I had recovered and kept in my files. "I found this in the evidence binder, Melanie," David said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through her screaming like a diamond through glass. "You told me he hated me. You told me he was losing his connection to the family. You spent 3 years trying to turn me into an orphan while he was still sitting right there. You didn't just steal his pearls, Mel. You stole my father, and for that there is no settlement." He turned his back on her. "Take her out," Vance ordered. The marshals didn't be gentle. They led Melanie out through the center aisle. She was sobbing now, real tears this time, the kind born of the realization that the G-Wagon, the boutique, and the $150K pension had all vanished into a prison cell. As the doors swung shut behind her, Judge Vance looked at me. The hanging judge expression softened, just for a second. "Arthur," he said, "the sua sponte motion is granted in its entirety. I'm also issuing an immediate restraining order and a freezing of assets for Petal and Stone Designs, pending the criminal investigation. Is there anything else the court can do for you today?" I stood up. I adjusted my silver tie. I felt the weight of the ghost gavel settle into my hand one last time. "Just one thing, Your Honor," I said. "I'd like the record to reflect that at 10:45 a.m. on this Monday, March 30th, 2026, I am fully aware exactly what year it is, and I am fully aware that the law, while slow, is never, ever blind." Vance nodded. "The record shall so reflect. This hearing is adjourned." I walked out of the courtroom with David. In the hallway, the support team, Melanie's boutique friends, scattered like roaches in a spotlight. They didn't want to be associated with a woman heading to a holding cell. We walked to the elevator in silence. When the doors closed, David leaned his head against the cool metal wall. "It's over, isn't it?" he asked. "The trial is over, David, but the sentencing is just beginning. We have a locket to open, we have a $4 million trust to stabilize, and we have a house that needs to be cleared of the smell of expensive perfume and cheap lies. Because when a judge takes the stand, the verdict isn't just a piece of paper. It's a life sentence of the truth."
The Sterling estate didn't feel like a crime scene anymore. It felt like a library after a long overdue cleaning. The silence was no longer heavy with Melanie's whispered lies or the clinical scratching of Dr. Arris's pen. It was the quiet of a house that had been vindicated. 6 months had passed since Courtroom 1A. I stood in my study, the digital vault open on my primary monitor. Melanie's sentencing had been a masterclass in the slow grind of justice. Sentence: 36 months for perjury and fraud. Restitution: $112,000 to the Sterling estate. Assets seized from Petal and Stone Designs. Her G-Wagon had been repossessed.
Her boutique was a vacant storefront with a for lease sign that matched the emptiness of her defense. She was currently wearing a state-issued jumpsuit, learning that in a cell, pearls are just a choking hazard. David walked into the room, carrying a small, polished wooden chest. He looked different. The vibration of anger had been replaced by a quiet, steady strength. He'd spent the last few months working with my old clerks to settle the Eleanor Sterling trust. "The excommunication is final, Dad," David said, setting the chest on my desk. "The judge signed the order. Under the conduct clause, the divorce settlement is capped at the statutory minimum. She won't touch a cent of Mom's legacy. Not now, not ever." "And the locket, David?" "It's back where it belongs," he said, opening the chest. Inside sat the silver locket and the pearls. We had spent the weekend retrieving the items Melanie had distributed to her friends and pawn shops. It had taken 3 private investigators and 5 search warrants, but the box was full again. "She thought she was stealing a pension, David," I said, picking up the locket. "She was so blinded by the $12K a month that she walked right past the $4 million. That's the problem with people who play the short game. They always trip over the horizon." "What are we going to do with the trust, Dad? I don't need $4 million. "We're going to do what your mother would have wanted," I said. "We are establishing the Eleanor Sterling Foundation for Elder Justice. We're going to fund the legal fees for every Arthur Sterling out there who doesn't have a 4K recording suite or a hanging judge on speed dial. We're going to make sure the Melanies of the world have nowhere left to hide." David smiled, a real, wide, Sterling smile. "I think Mom would like that, a lot." I walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The roses were in bloom, their red petals deep and vibrant against the white picket fence. The world was moving on, but for the first time in years, it was moving in the right direction. "David," I said, turning back to my son, "I think it's time we went for a walk. I want to see the sunset from the pier. And David, bring the locket. I think your mother would like to see the ocean one more time." "I'm right behind you, Judge," he said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old silver gavel, the travel-size one my staff gave me in '05. I didn't bang it on the desk. I just felt the cool weight of the metal. The audit was closed. The incompetency filing had been shredded by the very court it tried to deceive. The Sterling name was no longer a target, it was a shield. I walked out of the study and into the hallway. I didn't look at the cameras. I didn't check the microphones. I didn't need the record anymore. The truth was written in the air we breathed. "Type justice in the comments," I whispered to the empty hallway, the final open loop clicking shut with the precision of a bank vault. Because the law isn't just a set of rules, it's a promise. And today, that promise was kept. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.